Hello, everybody. Let's talk today about a subject which is not so often discussed in most Western media, and that is the relationship between China and Japan. That relationship has its heights and its lows, and now we're entering again a low point because basically what happened last week, November 7th, the newly appointed Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi, she told the Japanese parliament basically that any attack on Taiwan could constitute a situation threatening Japan's survival. Now, this might be for some among you a relatively new fact. However, it's not so new because she just repeats what Abe, the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, said was a well-known formulation that he said an emergency for Taiwan is an emergency for Japan. Now, why would Japan say that this emergency for Taiwan could be an emergency for Japan, which is more than just a rhetorical bluster, basically, because it could mean potentially that Japan could mobilize its security forces in case there would be some kind of a action from China towards Taiwan, a blockade or invasion or whatever has been discussed lately in the news. Now, of course, to put everything in context, Taiwan is not an independent country. It's not being recognized as an independent country by most countries in the world. There's no Western country, I think, for sure not the European Union and definitely not the United States, which do recognize Taiwan as an independent country because they have no diplomatic relations with them. And as a matter of fact, since the opening up of China and the meeting, of course, from Chairman Mao in those days and Nixon in the 70s, it was agreed that the US would not support any Taiwanese independence and would say, okay, Taiwan is an integral part of China, and that has been the official policy since then, basically. But obviously, Taiwan and the US are allies, and Japan and the US are allies. And obviously, that doesn't sit very well with China. And of course, Japan puts itself in that position. Now, the issue, the relations between Japan and China the problems basically go back a long time already. And of course, there are different sets of problems. One of the most important things is, of course, what happened during the Second World War. There are historical grievances from Japan towards China, basically, mainly because Japan not only occupied large chunks of China in the Second World War, but of course it invaded China. It killed 20 million people, so that's the same level as the Germans killed in the Soviet Union, basically. They committed tremendous atrocities in China, but Japan basically has never apologized for that, contrary to the Germans, of course, who apologized a lot. And of course, to put more oil on the fire, every year there is this Yasukuni shrine, with the Japanese leaders and even sometimes the Prime Minister. They visit that, and that shrine honors Japanese war dead, including convicted war criminals. And that, of course, is a source of anger, not only in China, but also in Korea. So that's the historical context. Of course, there are also different narratives about who is actually responsible for the war and why the war was fought. And that's also a different narrative in China and Japan. And I have experience there when you talk to Japanese about this. There's a very different idea about why the Second World War was fought and why Japan invaded China. They're much more apologetic for that, basically. And then, of course, more recently, there was a dispute between the so-called Diaoyu Islands in China, they call them, or they called in Japan the Senkaku Islands, which is islands actually very close to Taiwan, which is both claimed by China and Japan, of course. And of course, the more important thing now, of course, the very fact that, of course, China becomes militarily stronger. And of course, they think that, China said we have to be militarily stronger because the US wants to contain us. They have a ring of allies actually surrounding China. And of course, that's then also a problem for Japan because, of course, they are an ally of the United States and they feel, of course, kind of threatened by the whole situation. But of course, on the other hand, China and Japan have a big economic relationship. There's a tremendous amount, of course, of Japanese products being sold in China, and a lot of Chinese products, of course, being sold also in Japan. So obviously, this is a kind of very complex relationship that both countries have at the very moment. And sometimes in China, these things flare up. I remember one of the very last times in 2012, I lived in Beijing then actually, and there were a bunch of activists Japanese activists who went to these Diaoyu Islands, and they raised the Japanese flag there, which then of course in China was not accepted at all. And then a whole bunch of Chinese, they protested at the Japanese embassy, and which I saw with my own eyes basically because I lived very nearby the Japanese embassy. And they also caused a lot of damage and even destroyed some Japanese restaurants, which are actually owned by Chinese, but then because were Japanese restaurants, and then they destroyed them. They also damaged a lot of Japanese cars, of course, also Chinese owners, but they're Japanese cars. And even my wife, who drove a Japanese car actually in those days, I remember she went to the fuel station, but she couldn't get any fuel because they refused to give fuel to anybody who's driving a Japanese car. So in China, these are very sensitive things. And of course, now it starts to flare up again, basically because of these statements from the new prime minister. But obviously, this new prime minister, Takaichi, she has a history of being a nationalist. And China, of course, has been eyeing her since a while, since she took office as prime minister, basically. So she is a protege of the former Japanese prime minister Abe, and she has consistently taken positions strongly towards Beijing, and of course, which also will antagonize China. And one of these, for instance, is downplaying these Japanese war crimes in World War II. Now, obviously, for Japan, they consider China as very strategically important for them because a lot of Japanese trade will pass via Taiwan. And of course, they don't want to lose that towards China, basically. And that's why they think it's really important for them that they should get involved, even if there would be a military conflict. At least that's what they state for now. Now, of course, as mentioned, the China-Japanese relations are extremely delicate at best. Now, of course, it's getting worse again. And basically, when a nationalist like Takaichi becomes in charge in Japan, it's only a matter of time before these relations start to sour again. And obviously, when Japan continues to challenge China's red line, obviously Taiwan is a red line because Taiwan is very nationalistic, important for China. And of course, China will not accept anybody get involved or comment on what they call an internal situation in China, basically. And obviously, if Japan will continue to challenge China, then China will, of course, bring economic pressure to bear on Tokyo, including perhaps again rare earth metals and so forth. So basically, this is an ongoing story, which of course will heat up more and more in the future. Let's see how it ends up. Typically, China and Japan, they do tend to mend it more or less. Of course, they have very strong economic relationship. But let's see what happens in the future with the new Japanese prime minister. But obviously, this is a recipe for more tension in the near and far future. All right, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and we see each other very, very soon. Bye-bye.